seat. In 1951, Professor Helmut Richard Niebuhr. What a name, huh, kids? Yeah. Helmut. Exactly. That's what I'm thinking. Wrote a book titled Christ and Culture. And in his book, Helmut explores how Christians are to relate to culture. And he does so in three primary ways. So I'm going to give them to you. The first one is Christ in culture. And it's primarily understood as the blending of Jesus and all that Jesus is and the culture that the Christian is in. The big idea here is to, quote, reduce the tension between the church and the world. And in Niebuhr's view, this way of relating to culture is good in part and in theory, but it definitely falls apart in practice. The second one is Christ against culture, so the opposite. In this way of relating, loyalty to Jesus leads to an outright rejection of culture. A good example of this would be a monastic lifestyle where monks retreat to a monastery and they live in a practical, peaceful objection to culture. Trevin Wax, he's an author and a professor. He summarizes this way of living as follows. He says, the lines between the church and the world are sharp because the church is a community whose existence judges the world. Niebuhr credits the impressive sincerity of adherence to this position, but he rejects it as inadequate for its inability to extricate itself from the culture it condemns. Once again, there are some valuable parts to this idea, this way of relating to culture, but overall, it again falls apart. That's what Trevin was trying to highlight. Which leads to the third way that Niebuhr captures Christ above culture. Christ above culture. Now, in Niebuhr's mind, this is the dominant voice and view of the church throughout history, how it's interacted with culture, how Christians have interacted with culture. This view sees culture as both under God's judgment and under God's sovereign rule, which is why Niebuhr says, quote, the Christian must carry on cultural work in obedience to the Lord. So in other words, we cannot simply abandon culture, but we must not also blend with culture to the point where we are no longer distinct from the culture we are in. Rather, we must work as citizens in the kingdom of heaven to shape our culture. One of my favorite things about studying the Gospel of Matthew has been seeing how there is indeed a unique culture to the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven definitely has its own culture, and it's much more robust, and it's much more beautiful, and much more beneficial to its citizens than all of the best parts of every other culture combined. That's the beauty of the kingdom of heaven. It is the most robust, beautiful culture that has ever existed. Now, in our passage today, it involves Jesus teaching about how a Christian will participate in culture, but in this one, specifically through the lens of government, money, and taxation. Now, here's a bit of context before we get back into the passage, because I think it actually is very helpful. The remainder of the Gospel of Matthew, the rest of the book as we are going to study it, it's the week leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. So this is a very important week, with most of the content centered around Jesus' conflict with the chief priests and the religious leaders, the Pharisees, other leaders. The religious leaders, they feel threatened by Jesus. This is what's happening in this moment. They've been exposed by Jesus because of their sketchy practices, and now they are trying to find a way to trap Jesus. This is the effort that they're after. They want to have him arrested. And the reason they want to have him arrested rather than deal with him themselves is because Jesus is so beloved by the masses, so beloved by the people around him, that if they were to do something themselves, the people would turn on them. So all of the religious leaders and even some of the political leaders, we hear the Herodians, they're in there, we've talked about them before, they are plotting to trap Jesus. by getting him to do or say something that gets him in trouble with Rome or with the people around him. And so today's passage focuses on another example of one of these attempted traps. And so I want to revisit it. We're going to talk about what this looks like. We're going to talk about their tactics and how Jesus uses it to flip the script on them. So again, the first 3 verses from our passage today says this. It says, "Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him," that's clear, "in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?'" So this scene opens up with the religious leaders bringing Jesus a difficult question, right? But they don't just fire away with the question. They actually prop Jesus up as a wise teacher, right? They kind of start to compliment him. They say he's full of integrity, which we know he is, both of those things. But they don't really mean that, right? They're saying these things, of course, because they want people to think they mean it so that when in their mind Jesus flops, that they won't have a problem on their hands. But here's the problem with that strategy. Jesus never flops. He never flops. And if anyone should know that that's going to be the case, it is the religious leaders. Because Scripture, the Old Testament, has told them so for thousands of years. But still, they won't listen. Anybody in here have a hard time listening? Yeah? Couple of kids, couple of adults? They refuse to see what so many others have already seen in Jesus in this short time. They have all of this background, they should know better, and then they still refuse to see what the masses see. So they say to Jesus, "Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" Now, in my somewhat sports-saturated mind, forgive me for those of you who don't like sports, okay? But for those of you who do, you might appreciate this. I imagine, this is, again, me, Jesus thinking, in my best Allen Iverson voice, "Taxes? We're here talking about taxes? I'm here saving the world from sin and death, and we're here talking about taxes." Okay, my fellow old head sports fans will appreciate that one. And if you have no clue what I'm talking about, it's on YouTube. But in all seriousness, this is an outright obnoxious question from the Pharisees. But Jesus, he sees it coming because he's God in the flesh. And so he decides, rather than to rebuke them immediately, that he would play along with their game. Now, this is actually a very loaded question. And here is why. At that moment in history, where this conversation takes place, there are some seriously tumultuous political dynamics in play, far more than anything we experience here today. And Jerusalem is at the center of the Jewish world, but it's also under Roman rule. Now, Rome and their culture are in direct opposition to the Jewish culture. They have almost nothing in common, and so this makes for a serious cultural conflict in this region. And then on top of that, Rome instituted a tax that every single person in the region has to pay. And it's absorbed by the officials who rule, and it's for their benefit, and then the rest goes back to Rome, so the people paying it see no benefit whatsoever. This is the imperial tax that they're talking of. And so Jesus' response has serious consequences. One way or another. If Jesus says yes, pay the imperial tax, he could offend the masses. All the people around him, including a group of people who were labeled the Zealots. They're a group of basically imperial resistance leaders who are at this point in time gaining popularity with the people. They're so opposed. The Zealots are so opposed to the imperial rule and the tax that they would actually attack Roman caravans carrying that tax and then redistribute it. They were basically the people's champion at that time. So if Jesus were to support the imperial tax, his credibility would be compromised, at least with that group of people. And the religious leaders, they knew this. They knew this was going to be the case. But if Jesus were to outright deny the validity of the imperial tax, he would become a problem for Rome and for the officials governing that area. Now, if you're a history person at all, you know that people who created problems for Rome did not fare well in this era, if you know what I mean, right? So the Pharisees have put Jesus in this very tricky position. They've actually created a well-designed trap for him, which signals to us, and those of us who have been studying the Gospel of Matthew, who know the Gospel of Matthew, signals to us that they just clearly have not learned their lesson. Because every time they try to ask Jesus a trap question, not only does he respond perfectly, but his response sends them away looking silly to the people around them. We've seen this now time and time again, and yet they have not learned their lesson. Today's interaction is no different. We pick it back up in verse 18 with Jesus' response. It says, "But Jesus, knowing their evil intent," he already knew. He says, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius and he asked them, "Whose image is this? And whose inscription?" So Jesus asks a straightforward question, and there is indeed a straightforward answer. He says, "Hey, whose image is on this coin? Whose inscription?" And the answer is the image of Caesar on one side and the inscription of Caesar on the other. I actually have an example up there for you. This would have been visible to all people. Everyone who understood that this is Rome's rule, they lived in that world, they would have known this coin. So Jesus is stating something very, very obvious. Anyone in the crowd could have answered that the way that Jesus did. And that's exactly what happens. In Matthew 22:21 says, "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." Now, this is a simple but extremely brilliant response. You see, Jesus is actually communicating a very important reality to the follower of Jesus. This reality is that we have, as followers of Jesus, a dual citizenship. Every person who calls Jesus Lord is proclaiming that their primary citizenship is as a citizen in the kingdom of heaven. It's the primary citizenship. If you call Jesus Lord, if you have him as your Savior, if you are a follower of Jesus, a disciple of Jesus, your primary citizenship is to the kingdom of heaven, and then, and only then, as citizens to the country that you live in. Right? That's how it is. That's the biblical hierarchy for citizenship as a Christian, which means that we have rights in both kingdoms and responsibilities to both kingdoms or countries in our sake. I'm going to say that again. As citizens in the kingdom of heaven, our primary responsibility is to heaven and then to the country we live in, this beautiful country. And we have rights in both of those, and we have responsibilities to both of them. Okay, so we have responsibilities to the kingdom of heaven and to the country that we live in. Romans 13 says it this way. It's a bit longer, so follow along. Verses 1-7 says this: "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is why you pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. And then 1 Peter chapter 2 says it this way, starting in verse 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to emperor or supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. The Pharisees were trying to get Jesus to say something that would create more conflict than already existed. The division that existed between the Jews and the Romans was a major source of pain in this moment, a major source of hurt. And the Pharisees were trying to use that pain to trap Jesus, to get Jesus to say something that would further divide the two groups. But Jesus' response does the opposite. And he actually does it through simplification. He actually brings an order of operations into their chaos. Jesus is saying, it is possible for the people, it is possible to be for the people and for the culture around us, to be about it, to be for its good, and remain faithful to God, and remain faithful to his design for our life. So how? How do we do that? Because that seems so often in conflict, doesn't it? It can be very, very difficult. How does a follower of Jesus do this well? Well, I do think that there are, in nuanced situations, a lot of complexity. I actually think that you can distill it down to three pretty simple ideas to build from. Right? Each of us has the Spirit of God in our lives to discern in moment-by-moment situations how we are meant to respond, how to discern that. But just as a baseline, as a foundation to build upon, there are three kind of distinct ways people respond to relationships and to the culture around them. There's two that I think are unhealthy expressions, although they do exist, and then there's one sort of healthy way of living out this dual citizenship idea. And so I'm going to bring them to you. And these are actually ideas from the world of psychology and therapy. So if you see a therapist or if you've studied it, you might recognize these words. The first one is the idea of relating through enmeshment, or to be enmeshed, where our identity as a follower of Jesus is overly enmeshed with our relationships and roles in our everyday life. In that case, we can actually lose our sense of identity as a follower of Jesus, as a citizen in the kingdom of heaven. Some of the examples of the roles that we carry or that we play: parenting, right? Parents, different friendships, our career, our political aspirations, whatever that may be, we can be overly enmeshed in those, and this can lead to an over-pressurized dynamic with the people and the things that God has given us to steward. Did you catch that? If you're overly enmeshed, that can lead to an over-pressurized relationship to the things that God has given us to steward. So here's a good way of measuring how this is going for you. If you are overly agitated when you think of a particular cultural issue, then you are probably borderline enmeshed in that issue. Overly agitated, right? Not concerned, not involved, overly agitated. Then maybe you're a little too enmeshed in that. The second way is the opposite. It's disconnected, completely disconnected. The opposite of being enmeshed. You hold all of your relationships and roles in life at a distance, okay? You have this emotional kind of arms crossed attitude to the people around you and the things that God has set in your way. Thick walls in every relationship and every encounter. This way of interacting with the world around you is understandably often kind of the result of a hurt and a pain. And so there's no judgment here, but this is just a way of showing up into the world where you are disconnected. You might think of things as like, I got to do this. I have to do this. And there's a clear lack of joy in the relationships and the people around you. Ultimately, both that enmeshed way of being and that disconnected way of being, though, are not the biblical way we talk about in relating to and engaging culture, right, as a Christian. But there is a third way, and I think that this is the way. It's called differentiated and engaged. So we had enmeshed, we have disconnected, but this one is differentiated and engaged. And if you remember back to the beginning, I told you about Helmut Niebuhr's theories about how the Christians relate to the world, Christ above culture. This is the one that I think relates to that so well. That you have a healthy, centered person who has developed wise and appropriate boundaries. They are in deep relationship with those around them, and they are actively seeking to live out the well-being in their community as a citizen in the kingdom of heaven. Like a good cup of coffee or a nice meal at a restaurant or the warmth of a fire on a cold day, people who experience people who are differentiated and engaged leave that experience better than they came into it. We become these sort of dim reflections of the future glory that is to come. You see, the church should be this one place with wise, emotionally stable people who are very kind and loving, a non-anxious presence in an increasingly anxious culture. And that's not to say that you can't show up here hurt, because you can. It's not to say that you can't bring your pain and your wounds, because you can, because that is also the one place the church should be. But as we learn to follow Jesus and integrate his ways into our life, to be like him, to do what he did, that we become these people who are differentiated but engaged. Not enmeshed in culture, but with the culture, for the places that we live, for the places that we work. And we can do that because we know that God is both good and sovereign. We can do that because we are the citizens of the kingdom of heaven. And so this is what Jesus means when he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. Be for the place that you live. Be for the people around you as a citizen in the kingdom of heaven, as an agent of reconciliation. Now, I love how this passage closes out the reality of Jesus in this moment, that he's faced with this really impossible question. But then once again, flipping the script on the Pharisees and the religious leaders and showing them that he has so much more to give to this world than they could ever expect, that they are never going to defeat him or trap him. And he responds in a way that benefits everyone. Right? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. And then it says in verse 22, that when they heard this, when the people heard this, and when the Pharisees heard this response, they were amazed. So they left him and went away. They were amazed. Not just like, have you ever been in an argument with somebody and they say something that's right? You're like, oh, whatever. Right? That's not the response they gave. It says that they were amazed. Wouldn't it be amazing if just for once in your life, a group of people sincerely said to you, hey, you are amazing. Maybe you've had that, right? Some people bring a problem to you, a large crowd, they're trying to trick you, and you give a response, and they're like, wow, Will, you're amazing. Wouldn't that be nice? Don't you want to be amazing? Lincoln, do you want to be amazing? Yes, you do. Here's how you're amazing. Do you want the answer? Be like Jesus. Be like Jesus. If Jesus is amazing, which we know he is, then the best shot you have is to be like Jesus. And I know most of you very well. You are some amazing people, but not that amazing. Right? Not like whole group of people, come to you and they're like, wow, you're amazing. Tim, you're at a meeting in Callaway and they're like, Tim's amazing, everybody, right? Like we would love that, but the reality is we're not that amazing. But the more we are like Jesus, we're with him, we're like him, we do what he does, the better chance we have. And here's why I would advocate for being amazing. Because people are drawn to people who are amazing. People are drawn to Jesus. We've seen example after example after example of this in the Gospel of Matthew. People who should never have been around Jesus flocking to him because of who he is and how he treated them, because he was amazing. And so as people experience us, do they experience the amazing nature of Jesus? I sent a message to a friend this week, just thanking him for all the ways he's been generous in my life, just kind of a small encouragement. And here's how he responded. I'm actually going to read it to you guys. I'm not going to tell you who it is. He said, thanks, Rick. Yeah. That's it. That's all he said. No, it's not all he said. He said, to God be all the glory now and forevermore, because I am none of those things in the end myself. Everything good in me is just a dim reflection of Jesus shining through me. It is my great joy through Christ to have any impact in your life at all. Thanks for sharing. I love you. I think this person understands that. I think they understand what it means to be amazing. But they also recognize it's impossible without Jesus. I think that's why that response resonated with me. Because to be amazing is to be like Jesus. And something that is almost equally amazing is that Jesus himself said that we can do that we can do the same thing. As we believe in the promises of God, as we are obedient to his commands, as we, by the power of this Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit who shapes our lives and changes us in our soul, by that power, we can do what Jesus did. We can show his love, we can show his character, we can be amazing. And so that's my challenge as we reflect today. I'm going to have the band come up. We're just going to spend a minute in reflection, and we'll take communion together and sing a song. But I'd like for you to consider this question this week as you pray or as you think. Maybe you don't pray. As you have some time of self-reflection. How is God calling you to be for the people who are around you? That's the challenge that I feel like he was impressing on me too as I studied this, as I looked at Jesus' response to both, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, be a responsible citizen, and give to God what is God's. It's not a one or the other, it's a both and. We have benefits in both of our citizenships, and we have responsibilities in both of our citizenships. We are to be for the people around us as citizens in the kingdom of heaven. So who is God calling you to, and how is he calling you to be for them as a citizen in the kingdom of heaven?